Order.
The draft Greenhouse Gas Emissions Trading Scheme Amendment Order 2025.
I call the Minister to move the motion.
Thank you, Ms Harris. A pleasure as always to see you in the chair. I beg to move that the committee has considered the draft Greenhouse Gas Emissions Trading Scheme Amendment Order 2025. This order was laid before Parliament on 3rd of December 2024. And just set out a little bit of the background. The UK Emissions Trading Scheme was established under the Climate Change Act 2008 by the Greenhouse Gas Emissions Trading Scheme Order 2020 as a UK-wide greenhouse gas emissions trading scheme contributing to the UK's emissions reduction targets and net zero goal. The scheme is run by the UK ETS Authority, a joint body comprising the UK Government and the devolved governments. Our aim is to be predictable and responsible guardians of the scheme and its markets. Under the UK ETS, operators are required to monitor, report on and surrender allowances in respect of their greenhouse gas emissions. Most allowances are purchased at regularly held auctions. However, operators in certain sectors at risk of carbon leakage are given a number of allowances for free to manage their exposure to the carbon price and the risk that business decarbonisation efforts could be undermined by higher carbon imports. Under the UK ETS, an operator is the person who has control over an installation. An installation is a stationary unit at which regulated activities take place, and sub-installations represent operations carried out at an installation in respect of which free allocation operators are required to report activity levels for the purpose of the ETS. So this statutory instrument introduces the final year rule. We brought it forward to enable important changes and improvements to the scheme. Under previous UK ETS policy, where a sub-installation ceased operation, free allowances were no longer distributed in respect of that sub-installation in the year after the year in which it ceased operation. But the operator was entitled to retain the full amount of free allowances made available in respect of the sub-installation without recalculation to account for the permanent cessation of the sub-installation within the scheme year. In other words, if it ceased operations during 1 year, it still got the free allowances for the whole of that year. This had the potential to result in over-allocation of free allowances, as I've just said, beyond the volume required for carbon leakage mitigation, and the distribution of free allowances which were no longer associated with an activity which resulted in emissions. This statutory instrument ensures that the volume of free allocation which an operator is entitled to in the final year in which operations are carried out at one or more sub-installations is calculated by reference to the level of activity at the relevant sub-installation in that year. So that's the final year rule. To facilitate this change, this statutory instrument will require that operators prepare an activity level report in respect to the final year in which operations are carried out. That activity level report will be used to recalculate the volume of free allocation the operator is entitled to in the final year, and any over-allocation will be recoverable in accordance with the existing scheme rules. There is an exception to the final year rule in circumstances in which the permanent cessation of operations at a sub-installation is part of a series of changes which has resulted in a material reduction in the specified emissions per unit of production of those pre-cessation products which continue to be produced at the installation. This exception will incentivise decarbonisations as operators which can demonstrate that the relevant requirements are met will continue to be entitled to the free allocation calculated in accordance with existing UK ETS rules, which is calculated in advance on the basis of historic activity levels. The instrument also amends the circumstances in which an installation or sub-installation has ceased operation. The previous definition was at the point in time in which it became technically impossible to resume operation. This definition was difficult to apply consistently in practice. The updated definitions provide that an installation has ceased operation when all regulated activities, in the case of an installation, or the relevant operation, in the case of a sub-installation, have permanently ceased to be carried out at the installation. This amendment increases certainty for both the scheme regulators and operators. This instrument also introduced the requirement for operators to notify the relevant scheme regulator of circumstances in which all regulated activities cease to be carried out at an installation by the end of the scheme year in which the cessation occurs, or within 1 month of the date of cessation, whichever is later. and confirm whether the operator intends for one or more regulated activities to resume at the installation. Operators are similarly required to provide details of a cessation of operations in respect of a sub-installation in annual activity level reports prepared in relation to the 2025 scheme year and thereafter. Requiring these reports will facilitate the application of the new final year rule. This statutory instrument introduced a new power for regulators to issue a notice to an operator which determines that an installation or sub-installation has ceased operation for the purposes of UK ETS legislation. This new power is available in circumstances in which the regulator is not satisfied that the operator intends for regulated activities to resume at the installation or intends for regulated operations to resume at the sub-installation level. This change will increase certainty for operators and facilitate equivalent treatment for all installations undergoing a cessation. The changes follow comprehensive engagement and consultation with stakeholders. Between 18th December 2023 and 11th of March 2024, the UK and devolved governments ran a consultation seeking views on proposals to alter the free allocation methodology for the UK ETS stationary sectors to better target those most at risk of carbon leakage and ensure that free allocations are fairly distributed. The UK ETS free allocation review covered the provisions included in this statutory instrument on permanent cessations. The responses to the consultation were in broad support of the proposed technical changes to the treatment of permanent cessation. The authority response to the consultation will be delivered in two parts. An early response to the proposals on permanent cessations was published already last November. To conclude, Mrs Harris, the changes in the draft order will deliver on commitments made by the UK ETS authority and improve the operation and fairness of the scheme and increase certainty for both regulators and operators. The alterations to the UK ETS will support its role as a key pillar of the UK's climate policy. They show that we will take action to extend and improve the scheme where necessary. I commend this order to the committee.
The question is that the committee has considered the draft Greenhouse Gas Emissions Trading Scheme Amendment Order 2025. Shadow Minister Nick Timothy.
Thank you, Mrs Harris. It's a pleasure to serve under you this evening and a pleasure to respond to the draft order on behalf of His Majesty's opposition. We welcome the clarity provided by this specific legislation and will continue to scrutinise the details of the emissions trading scheme implementation under this government. It will be important to observe how aligned we are with Europe on carbon pricing. And regardless of the many policy decisions we face in the years ahead, as a matter of principle, we should always make sure we're competitive and not naive in our carbon pricing. Because the cost of energy affects our economy and the standard of living in fundamental ways. Without secure and affordable energy, industry cannot compete, jobs are lost and living standards fall. We've experienced unacceptable deindustrialisation in the years since 2008, and the trajectory of policy under this government means we will suffer a further loss in competitiveness in the years ahead, making the imbalances in our economy, in sectors and geography with a huge trade deficit and all the consequences that come from that far worse. That's why I want to take this opportunity to ask ministers about the assumption in the recent NISO report that the carbon price will rise to £147 per tonne of carbon dioxide by 2030 to meet the government's clean power target. This is an incredible number. The feasibility of the government's whole plan to decarbonise the grid by 2030 is entirely based on this number. When asked about the £147 carbon price by my right honourable friend, the member for Bromsgrove behind me, during a recent Select Committee hearing, the Secretary of State said, "I will not endorse these assumptions." And yet he said, we work hand in glove with NISO, not just on modelling, but on all these questions. And he insisted that the NISO report proves that his department's clean power plan can be delivered. The government cannot have it both ways. Either ministers must be honest and admit that the carbon price will increase to £147 per tonne of carbon dioxide because of government policy, or confess that the 2030 target for clean power will never be reached. And the many claims they've made while citing the NISO report were utter nonsense. Earlier today, representatives of Britain's energy-intensive industries, including steel, glass, ceramics, chemicals, paper and mineral products, wrote a public letter to the Industry Minister to express their frustration with being held back by, quotes, high electricity prices, policy uncertainty and the risk of carbon leakage. Energy-intensive industries know what it means for their survival, saying they will, quotes, not be able to bear these carbon costs. We should be clear about what the £147 figure would mean, the destruction of industry in this country and the death, while such opportunities are in their infancy, of British artificial intelligence. How many members of the committee present here today have consulted the NISO report and its technical annexes? If they haven't done so already, then I strongly urge them to ask themselves whether they accepted this projected carbon price figure and how business might respond to such a drastic increase. How many jobs this will cost? How much higher will bills go? We should be clear. Increasing the cost of carbon will be destructive for the economic well-being of this country. Ministers and supporters of the government should be upfront with the British people and with British industry about this fact. And I implore those on the committee today, because they will be asked to keep voting for this mindless Milibandism, to read up, to listen to industry, listen to the technical experts, and I don't mean Dale Vince, before lending their support and credibility to this destruction. If they go along with it, history will be most unkind to them. Of course, we should remember that the government was elected on a solemn manifesto promise that their policies would cut household energy bills by £300 per year by 2030. The Secretary of State and his ministers in the department have studiously avoided repeating this promise time and again since July, because the government knows this promise was nonsense, and whatever the outward zeal, really, so does the Secretary of State, but he is too afraid to admit it. Following the government's budget spending spree, the Office for Budget Responsibility made clear that environmental levies will have to increase to as much as almost £15 billion thanks to the policies of the Secretary of State. This means households will each pay £120 more in environmental levies, and this is on top of all the hidden costs in the system. The subsidies, the balancing costs, the new interconnectors, the massive upgrades to the grid and distribution networks that ministers pretend do not exist, while they tell the public that renewables are cheap. The news gets worse for British business. The UK was once a net exporter of energy with internationally competitive energy prices, but this is no longer the case. We've been a net importer of energy since 2004, and our import dependency has increased from 13% in 2005 to 41% in 2023. Industrial energy prices have increased from 4.56 pence per kilowatt in 2005 to 25.46 pence per kilowatt in 2023. Industrial energy prices in the UK are now 50% higher than other advanced economies on average. Our industrial energy prices are 4 times higher than in China and 3 times higher than in America and Canada. They're higher than in France, which has significant nuclear energy capacity. We are artificially driving up costs with a misguided drive to decarbonise before the technology is ready. And to be clear, I know my party played a part in this, as my right honourable friend, the leader of the opposition, has acknowledged. But we are looking at the evidence and being honest about the mistakes we made. The party opposite is denying the evidence and driving us faster and faster towards the abyss.
Remember to keep the debate to the subject in hand.
This is fundamental to the ETS, because there is nothing more important to the future of our country than the future of energy policy. Getting policy right means being straight about the trade-offs. The energy trilemma has not been resolved. We must choose how best to prioritise. We must do what other countries are doing and put cost and security ahead of decarbonisation. Thank you.
Minister McCarthy.
Thank you, and I suppose I should welcome the Shadow Minister to his place. I think it's a bit depressing, though, to hear him outline what the current opposition's position is, and we saw some of these U-turns rowing back on trying to get to net zero and recognising that getting to net zero was an integral part of our growth strategy, of our industrial strategy, of the protecting future of jobs and investment in this country. We saw some of that during the last year or two of being in government, but to hear it spelt out in such stark terms, I think is disappointing, because we absolutely recognise that it, as I've said, it is part of our growth strategy. It's also, energy security is very much at the heart of what we do in the wake of Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine and other global factors. The shift away from the volatile fossil fuel markets isn't just about that desire to reach net zero, though of course that's really important, and we see the evidence of what happens if you don't tackle climate change around us every day, but it is also about protecting our security. And the UK emissions trading scheme is a key pillar of that climate and net zero policy regime and our industrial strategy. It sets a cap on the emissions in the sectors covered, which currently represent about a quarter of the UK's emissions. And in doing so, it guarantees that these sectors will reduce their emissions in line with our world-leading net zero target. We believe that maintaining a strong UK ETS will play a key role in making Britain a clean energy superpower, delivering our mission of secure and clean electricity by 2030 and cutting bills. The ETS makes fossil fuel electricity generation face the costs of its pollution. It is only a small component of electricity bills, especially when compared to wholesale gas prices. And as power generation continues to shift to renewables and nuclear, and we reduce our reliance on volatile international gas markets, so the impact on bills will fall and reduce these costs to consumers. Only fossil fuel electricity generation will be captured by the UK ETS, so the increasing uptake of renewables and nuclear power will reduce these costs for consumers. And by driving green investment as part of our industrial strategy, the UK ETS will also help deliver a just transition, growing the UK's economy and securing good jobs for people across the country. I think the Shadow Minister was arguing that decarbonisation was coming too fast, but we are absolutely at the forefront of the new technologies and industries. My colleague here from Redcar could wax lyrical about what it means for a constituency like hers, with a strong industrial base, but its future is built on the decarbonisation and the technology and the jobs that accompany that. As I've said, delivering an industrial strategy is the centrepiece of the government's growth mission. It will make us energy independent while creating jobs and providing investment in communities across the UK. A key part of this will be investing in and creating the right conditions for the green industries of the future to flourish. And the UK ETS is a vital element of this approach. It sets out a clear trajectory for emissions from the sectors covered and driving investment in decarbonisation. In November 2024, the UK ETS Authority set out an early response in its proposals on permanent cessations. And as I've said, this statutory instrument will implement those changes and improvements to the scheme following detailed consultation. These changes have the support of the 4 governments of the UK. I think Scotland and Wales have already approved it, and Northern Ireland is about to consider it in the next few days. So there's a consensus in advancing carbon pricing policy, which adds to the strength of the UK ETS. The Shadow Minister mentioned the need for close cooperation with the EU, and that is certainly something that we want to achieve as well. To ensure the scheme continues to remain a key driver of decarbonisation, our intention is to expand its scope further. We've recently consulted on proposals to expand the scheme to energy from waste and waste incineration, and we've also recently consulted on expansion to maritime operators and on a regulatory framework for integrating non-pipeline transport for carbon capture, usage and storage. Beyond these new sectors, we're exploring options to build the UK ETS into the world's first integrated market for carbon emissions and carbon removal. And subject to consultation, our intention is to include engineered greenhouse gas removals. This would support the new technologies we will need to meet net zero, while providing a sustainable path for industry to decarbonise and flourish. We recognise the importance of long-term certainty to decarbonisation planning. The authority's intention is to run the scheme until at least 2050. The authority published a long-term pathway for the UK ETS in December 2023, outlining our intention to consult on extending the scheme beyond its current date of 2030. We will consult on that and any cap for any future scheme phases in due course. So to conclude, Ms Harris, we are committed to be attentive to views and bringing forward changes as required to ensure the scheme operates efficiently to achieve emissions reductions. We do think this is an integral part, sorry, I was doing quite well until an integral part of our journey on the path to decarbonisation coupled with industrial growth, and therefore I commend this draft order to the committee. Yeah.
The question is that the committee has considered the draft Greenhouse Gas Emissions Trading Scheme Amendment Order 2025. As many of their opinions say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order.